A white flight attendant sneers and shames a passenger, never guessing he's the airline's hidden owner. He sits in silence, recording every insult and storing each cruel word. Then, the moment the plane lands, he makes a single boardroom call that erases the entire empire. What will justice at 30,000 feet really cost them all? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The morning sun filtered through the towering windows of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, casting long shadows across the terminal's polished floors. At gate C-17, Elijah Ward stood quietly in line, his dark hoodie and jeans helping him blend into the crowd of early travelers. Through his glasses, his observant eyes took in every detail of the scene unfolding before him. The gate agents moved with hurried efficiency, their faces showing the strain of another busy morning. Passengers shifted impatiently in line, checking phones and watches, some muttering under their breath about delays. But it was the scene at the security checkpoint that caught Elijah's attention. A young black mother, probably in her late 20s, stood at the counter with her two small children. The security officer held her ID up to the light, examining it with exaggerated scrutiny. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see additional identification," the officer said, his tone carrying an edge of authority that seemed unnecessary. Elijah watched as the woman dug through her purse, her children fidgeting beside her. Just ahead of her, a white couple had passed through moments earlier with barely a glance at their documents. The contrast wasn't lost on him, it never was. He'd seen this scene play out countless times before, in airports across the country. The line inched forward, and Elijah noticed his boarding pass. Zone 2 had been crossed out, replaced with Zone 4 in hasty red ink. He'd specifically chosen his seat early and paid extra for the privilege, but somehow his boarding zone had been changed without explanation or notification. When the final boarding call came, Elijah waited patiently as other passengers filed past him. The gate attendant, a woman in her early 30s with carefully styled blonde hair, called each zone with practiced efficiency. Her smile, warm and welcoming for most passengers, cooled noticeably when Elijah finally approached. "Boarding pass, please," she said, her tone clipped. She frowned at the ticket, running it through the scanner twice. The machine beeped in protest. "There seems to be an issue with your ticket." Elijah remained silent, his face composed as she scrutinized the boarding pass again. He'd been through this routine before. The sudden computer issues, the extra checks, the unspoken questions in their eyes. "One moment, sir," she said, tapping at her keyboard with manicured fingers. Her frown deepened. "It appears your seat assignment has been changed. You'll be in 17B now." Elijah nodded, accepting the newly printed boarding pass without comment. He'd paid extra for a seat with additional legroom in the front section, but now he found himself assigned to a middle seat in the back half of the plane. The change made no logical sense, unless you understood the unspoken rules that sometimes governed these decisions. As he made his way down the jet bridge, Elijah mentally recorded every detail: the time of the flight, the gate number, the names of the staff visible on their badges, all filed away in his photographic memory. These details might seem insignificant now, but experience had taught him that patterns emerged from these small moments. Stepping onto the plane, Elijah felt the familiar weight of eyes following his movement. The flight attendant at the entrance barely acknowledged him, though she'd greeted the passengers ahead with warm smiles. As he moved down the narrow aisle, he caught the quick glances from other passengers, some curious, others wary, a few deliberately looking away. A businessman in first class tightened his grip on his laptop bag as Elijah passed. A woman pulled her purse closer to her chest. Small gestures, almost unconscious reactions, but Elijah noticed them all. His training in psychological profiling had only sharpened his natural ability to read these subtle social cues. Finding row 17, Elijah carefully stored his carry-on in the overhead compartment. The white man seated in the aisle seat gave him a brief nod, not friendly, not hostile, just a bare acknowledgement of his existence. Elijah settled into the middle seat, his tall frame cramped in the limited space he'd specifically paid to avoid. A few rows ahead, Karen Delaney stood in the aisle, helping another passenger stow their luggage. Her efficient movements paused as she caught sight of Elijah. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing slightly as she watched him adjust his seatbelt. The look was familiar to Elijah, the same expression he'd seen countless times in his journey from Detroit's working-class neighborhoods to the boardrooms of his aviation empire. The cabin doors closed with a heavy thunk, sealing them all in for the journey ahead. Karen turned away, resuming her duties, but Elijah had already noticed how her attention kept drifting back to row 17. He sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, appearing to all the world like just another passenger on just another flight. But beneath his calm exterior, Elijah's mind worked with the precision of the engineer he'd once been, recording every interaction, every slight, every moment that would later form part of a larger picture. The empire he'd built, Skyloom, had taught him that real change required more than just reaction. It demanded careful observation, strategic patience, and the wisdom to know when to act. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane prepared for departure. Outside the small window, the morning sun continued its climb into the Atlanta sky, casting long shadows across the tarmac. Inside, the usual pre-flight routine continued, but the tension in the air around row 17 remained, invisible but palpable, like static before a storm. The plane leveled at cruising altitude, its gentle hum becoming background noise as passengers settled into their routines. Some pulled out laptops or tablets, while others reclined their seats hoping to catch a quick nap. The seatbelt sign dimmed with a soft ding, and the familiar sounds of drink service preparation echoed from the galley. Starting from row 10, Karen Delaney pushed the beverage cart down the narrow aisle with practiced efficiency. Her movements were smooth, her smile bright, at least for certain passengers. Elijah watched with keen attention, his engineer's mind cataloging patterns in her service style. A white businessman in 12C received a full can of ginger ale with his cup of ice. "There you go, sir. Let me know if you need anything else," Karen said warmly. 2 rows behind him, an Asian woman asked for the same drink. Karen poured just enough to fill the plastic cup, quickly stowing the can back in the cart. The pattern continued as the cart moved closer to row 17. A white teenager got a full can of Sprite. A Latino father received only a partially filled cup of Coke. Each interaction added another data point to Elijah's mental log, confirming what he'd suspected from the moment he boarded. Through it all, Elijah sat quietly, his posture relaxed but alert. His hands rested loosely in his lap, his expression neutral behind his glasses. To casual observers, he might have appeared lost in thought or even dozing, but his attention never wavered from Karen's systematic display of bias. The beverage cart finally reached row 17. Karen served the white man in 17A first, her smile professional and warm. "What can I get for you, sir?" "Diet Coke, please," the man replied. "Here you go, you can have the whole can," Karen said, placing both the cup and can on his tray table. The man nodded his thanks, though Elijah noticed his slight frown as he observed Karen's demeanor shift. When Karen turned to Elijah, her smile vanished. Her eyes held that familiar look, the one that suggested his mere presence was an inconvenience. Elijah met her gaze calmly. "Water, please," he said quietly, his voice carrying the same respectful tone he'd used in countless boardrooms and business meetings. Karen's eyes rolled dramatically, her lips curling into a sneer. "You people always want more than what you pay for," she said, her voice deliberately loud enough to carry to nearby rows. She roughly poured water into a cup, filling it only halfway before practically dropping it on his tray table. The cabin air seemed to thicken with tension. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, pretending not to notice the exchange. The man in 17A tensed visibly, his fingers tightening around his Diet Coke can. Elijah absorbed the insult with the same quiet dignity he'd maintained throughout his career. His face remained composed, though something flickered briefly in his dark eyes. Not anger, but a deep, familiar hurt carefully contained. He nodded once, accepting the half-filled cup without comment. Karen continued down the aisle, her demeanor instantly brightening as she served the white passengers in row 18. She chatted pleasantly with them about their destination, offering extra napkins and snacks without prompting. The contrast in her behavior was stark, almost theatrical in its transparency. Throughout the remainder of the drink service, Karen made a point of ignoring Elijah completely. When she passed back up the aisle collecting trash, she reached across him to take the empty cup from 17A but left Elijah sitting on his tray table. Her actions spoke volumes, each slight adding another line to the story writing itself in Elijah's memory. After several minutes, Elijah calmly reached up and pressed the call button. The soft ding seemed to echo through the cabin. Karen's shoulders stiffened visibly at the sound. She turned slowly, her face hardening as she spotted the illuminated light above row 17. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor as she marched back to his row. Another flight attendant, Leslie, followed a few steps behind, watching the scene unfold with poorly concealed interest. "That's your last warning for being disruptive," Karen snapped, her voice sharp enough to draw attention from several rows in either direction. Her finger jabbed toward the call button light, as if it were a personal offense. Behind her, Leslie let out a soft laugh, sharing in Karen's obvious disdain. A third flight attendant, Jamal, stood further back, his expression uncomfortable but silent. Elijah's response was simple but powerful in its own way. Without a word, he reached into his bag and retrieved a small notebook and pen. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. The pen moved across the paper with quiet purpose as he wrote down 3 names: Karen, Leslie, Jamal. His handwriting was neat and precise, each letter a testament to the methodical nature that had helped him build an aviation empire from nothing. The names stood stark against the white paper, a simple list that somehow carried the weight of something much larger. The cabin air grew stale as the flight continued, filled with the quiet murmur of conversations and the occasional laugh. Elijah remained still in his seat, but his eyes moved constantly, taking in every detail of life at 35,000 feet. His attention wasn't casual. It was the same focused observation that had once helped him identify systemic problems in complex engineering systems. From his vantage point in 17B, he had a clear view of most of the cabin. The overhead lights created pools of dim illumination, casting shadows that highlighted the distinct zones of service quality that had emerged during the flight. His gaze settled on row 23, where a Punjabi woman in a beautiful emerald green salwar kameez sat beside the window. For nearly 10 minutes, her hand remained raised, patient but increasingly uncertain. Flight attendants passed by repeatedly, their eyes sliding past her as if she were invisible. The woman's dignity never wavered, though Elijah noticed her shoulders gradually slump with each ignored attempt to get attention. Karen walked past twice, somehow managing to look everywhere except at row 23. Leslie breezed by with a fresh pot of coffee, serving only the passengers who fit her preferred profile. The woman's hand stayed raised, her need for assistance, whatever it might be, remaining unaddressed. In row 19, a different scene unfolded. A Latino man in business casual attire stood up and made his way to the rear lavatory. Elijah watched as the man returned to his seat several minutes later, only to be confronted by one of the flight attendants who hadn't been involved in the earlier drink service. "Sir, what were you doing back there?" The flight attendant's voice carried an edge of suspicion that made several nearby passengers look up from their devices. The man's response was calm but confused. "Using the restroom." "You were there for quite a while," the attendant pressed, her tone suggesting something nefarious. "We need to ensure the safety of all passengers." The man's face flushed with embarrassment as other passengers turned to watch the exchange. "I wasn't feeling well," he explained quietly, clearly uncomfortable with having to justify a basic human need in front of strangers. "Well, just remember we're watching," the attendant said pointedly before moving away, leaving the man to sink into his seat, his dignity wounded by the public questioning. Elijah's pen moved across his notebook again, recording the incident with the same precise detail he'd used to document the earlier interactions. His face remained neutral, but his jaw tightened slightly, the only visible sign of his internal response to the mounting evidence of systemic bias. Movement in row 15 caught his attention. A white passenger, perhaps in his mid-40s, wearing a navy blue blazer and khakis, was holding his phone at an angle that suggested he was recording. The man's technique was subtle, phone partially obscured by a magazine, screen brightness turned down low, but Elijah recognized the intent behind the positioning. The timing proved significant. Karen had just finished another interaction with a black passenger, her tone dripping with the same condescension she'd shown earlier. The man's phone captured it all. Her rolled eyes, her dismissive gesture, the passenger's quiet resignation. Karen turned, and for a moment Elijah thought she might miss it. But her eyes narrowed as they fell on the man's phone. Her entire demeanor shifted, the false professional smile replaced by something harder, more threatening. She moved closer to row 15, leaning down under the pretense of checking a seatbelt. Her whispered words carried just far enough for Elijah to hear. "I'll make sure you're on a no-fly list." The effect was immediate. The man's hands trembled slightly as he lowered his phone, tucking it away quickly. His face had gone pale, the reality of the threat sinking in. For someone who likely traveled frequently for business, the prospect of being banned from flying was more than just an inconvenience. It was a career threat. Elijah studied the man's face intently, committing every detail to his photographic memory. The slight crow's feet around blue eyes, the small scar near his right temple, the way his left eyebrow arched slightly higher than his right. In his mind, he labeled the face, potential witness. The man avoided eye contact with everyone for the remainder of the flight, his earlier courage crushed by Karen's threat. He kept his hands folded in his lap, his phone untouched, his posture suggesting someone trying to become invisible. Elijah closed his notebook deliberately, sliding it back into his bag. The pages now contained a detailed record of the flight's events, times, names, specific incidents, but the most important evidence was stored in his memory. Every interaction, every dismissive gesture, every biased service decision was filed away with perfect clarity, ready to be recalled when needed. He leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes, though his mind remained alert. The cabin pressure changed subtly, and the plane's nose dipped slightly as they began their initial descent. The familiar whir of the landing gear lowering filled the cabin, marking the beginning of the end of this revealing journey. The mechanical sound of the landing gear locking into place seemed to underscore the weight of everything Elijah had witnessed. The same precise engineering that kept planes safely in the air couldn't address the human biases that plagued the spaces within them. That would require a different kind of solution, one that Elijah was uniquely positioned to design. The plane touched down at JFK with a gentle bump, its wheels squealing against the tarmac as it decelerated. The cabin filled with the familiar chorus of seatbelt clicks and overhead bin latches. Passengers stood in the narrow aisle, their eagerness to deplane evident in their shifting feet and restless adjustments of carry-on bags. Karen stationed herself near the front exit, performing her final duty of the flight. Her transformation was remarkable to watch. For white passengers, her smile brightened, her voice warm and cheerful as she called out, "Thank you for flying with us. Have a wonderful day." Her teeth gleamed, her eyes crinkled with seeming sincerity. But for passengers of color, the change was stark. Her smile vanished, replaced by tight lips and distant eyes. Some received mumbled, barely audible farewells. Others got nothing at all, just silence as they passed, as if they were invisible. The Punjabi woman from 23A received a cold stare. The Latino businessman from the 19th century was met with turned shoulders. Elijah remained seated, watching this performance with the same quiet attention he'd maintained throughout the flight. He waited until most passengers had deplaned, his patience a stark contrast to the earlier rush. When he finally stood, he moved with unhurried precision, collecting his bag with careful movements. As he made his way toward the exit, Karen's performance reached its final act. She stared straight ahead as he approached, her face a mask of practiced indifference. No smile, no acknowledgement, not even the professional courtesy she'd shown to other passengers. Elijah passed by without comment, but his eyes registered every detail of this last interaction. The terminal bustled with afternoon activity, travelers rushing to connections, families reuniting, business people striding purposefully toward exits. Elijah moved through this chaos with calm determination, his hoodie still up, his presence barely rippling the crowd around him. Near the baggage claim area, a figure stood apart from the chaos. A chauffeur in a perfectly pressed black suit held a simple white sign with just 2 letters. Mr. W. double quote. His posture was professional, his expression neutral. When Elijah approached, the chauffeur gave a single, understanding nod. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The black town car glided through Manhattan traffic with the smoothness of experience. Inside, Elijah sat in the back seat, the privacy partition raised. The city's afternoon light filtered through tinted windows, casting subtle shadows across his lap as he reviewed his handwritten notes. The notebook pages contained precise documentation, times, names, specific incidents. Each entry was written in clear, methodical handwriting, the kind that revealed an engineer's mind, someone used to documenting system failures and points of weakness. After reviewing the notes, Elijah reached into his bag and retrieved a small flash drive, previously hidden in a concealed pocket. The metallic device caught the light as he inserted it into a tablet. The screen came to life, displaying footage from multiple angles within the aircraft cabin. The video quality was crystal clear, captured by hidden cameras he'd arranged to be placed throughout the plane. Karen's face appeared in frame after frame, each clip revealing what she thought no one was watching. Her dismissive eye rolls, her condescending smirks, her threatening posture when confronting the man who'd tried to film her, all preserved in high definition. The car wound its way through the city, eventually turning toward the Hudson River. The setting sun painted the sky in deep oranges and purples, reflecting off the glass facades of Manhattan's west side. The town car pulled up to one of these buildings, a towering structure of steel and glass that seemed to pierce the darkening sky. Elijah stepped out, his movements still unhurried but purposeful. The building's lobby was all polished marble and subtle lighting, but he bypassed the main entrance. Instead, he approached a private elevator tucked away from public view. A sleek biometric scanner waited beside the elevator doors, its surface gleaming in the carefully designed lighting. He placed his hand on the scanner, watching as green light traced his fingerprints. A second scanner at eye level captured his retinal pattern. The system processed his identity in seconds, confirming his clearance for the building's most secure floor. The elevator doors opened silently, inviting him into a private car lined with rich wood paneling. The elevator rose smoothly to one of the tower's highest floors. When the doors opened, they revealed an executive office suite that spoke of power and precision. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the Hudson River, now reflecting the last rays of sunset. The city spread out below, a tapestry of lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Elijah moved to a private changing area within the office. He removed his hoodie, the casual disguise that had allowed him to move through the airport unrecognized. From a hidden closet, he retrieved a tailored blazer, its cut and fabric speaking of quiet wealth and authority. As he put it on, his transformation became complete, from unassuming passenger to corporate power broker. An assistant waited quietly by the door, tablet in hand, already anticipating the next move. Elijah turned to face them, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone used to making decisions that affected thousands. "Call the board," he said simply. "Emergency session tonight." The Manhattan skyline had transformed into a glittering tapestry of lights by the time the board members of Skyloom Airlines began arriving at the corporate headquarters. The executive boardroom, occupying most of the west side of the top floor, slowly filled with quiet conversations and questioning glances. 12 chairs surrounded the massive glass conference table, each occupied by someone who helped steer one of the largest airlines in North America. The room itself spoke of power and success. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the Hudson River and New Jersey beyond, while a massive touchscreen wall dominated the eastern side of the room. Patricia Chen, head of operations, checked her watch for the third time in 5 minutes. Next to her, Marcus Thompson, chief financial officer, drummed his fingers on the polished glass surface. Across the table, Sarah Williams, vice president of customer relations, whispered something to James Rodriguez, their recently appointed head of human resources. "Any idea what this is about?" Rodriguez asked, his voice carrying more than he intended in the quiet room. "Your guess is as good as mine," Williams replied, adjusting her blazer. "Emergency sessions aren't exactly common." At the far end of the table, Bernard Knox, one of the senior-most board members, made no effort to hide his annoyance. "Some of us had dinner plans," he announced to no one in particular, his bow tie slightly askew. "This better be important." The room's lighting suddenly dimmed slightly, and the massive screens along the wall illuminated with a soft blue glow. The side door opened quietly, and a figure entered without fanfare or announcement. The man wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that spoke of quiet wealth rather than flashy ostentation. His movements were measured and deliberate as he approached the front of the room. Some board members squinted, trying to place his face. Others sat perfectly still, recognition dawning with varying degrees of shock. Bernard Knox's mouth fell open slightly. Patricia Chen's hand froze midway through writing a note. The room's atmosphere shifted palpably as the man reached the touchscreen wall and turned to face them. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm but carrying easily across the room. "I'm Elijah Ward, founder, silent shareholder, cultural integrity officer." A wave of gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. Papers rustled as people shifted in their seats. Sarah Williams's water glass clinked against the table as her hand trembled slightly. Marcus Thompson found his voice first, though it came out higher than usual. I thought you sold your stake?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Elijah's response was measured, his eyes scanning the room. "I diversified. I didn't disappear." The statement landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of unease through the assembled executives. Bernard Knox's face had lost some of its color. Patricia Chen sat straighter, her expression carefully neutral but her fingers gripping her pen too tightly. Without further explanation, Elijah reached into his suit jacket and removed a small flash drive. The simple device seemed to command everyone's attention as he walked to the console embedded in the wall. The insertion of the drive was barely audible, but in the tense silence of the room it might as well have been a thunderclap. The screens came to life simultaneously, 8 different displays filled with various footage, some from body cameras, others from fixed positions throughout aircraft cabins. The quality was crystal clear, the audio precise. Dates and timestamps appeared in the corners, spanning the last 6 months. "For the past half year," Elijah continued, his voice still calm, but now carrying an edge of steel, "I've been conducting a comprehensive cultural audit of our airline." He touched the screen, bringing up a series of flight manifests. 37 flights, economy class, first class, even as crew. The board members watched in growing discomfort as clips began to play. In one, a flight attendant ignored repeated calls from an elderly Asian passenger. In another, a gate agent's tone shifted dramatically between customers of different races. Each incident was meticulously documented, time-stamped, and categorized. "The findings," Elijah said, "are concerning." He touched the screen again, and a new clip began to play. Karen Delaney's face filled the central screen. The footage showed her leaning close to another flight attendant, speaking in what she thought was a private moment. Her smirk was clearly visible as she glanced toward a passenger of color struggling with overhead luggage. "Bet his card gets declined too," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. The room fell completely silent. Even the usual sounds of the building seemed muted, as if the very air had been sucked out of the space. Bernard Knox's face had gone from red to ashen. Sarah Williams stared at her hands, unable to look at the screen. Marcus Thompson's mouth opened and closed without sound. The footage continued to play across the multiple screens, each one showing a different angle of systematic bias and discrimination. The board members sat frozen, watching their carefully maintained corporate image crumble before their eyes. The evidence was undeniable, the documentation meticulous, and the implications enormous. As Karen Delaney's voice continued to play through the speakers, the faces around the table reflected a dawning recognition of just how deep their problems ran. Some showed shock, others guilt, and a few displayed the beginning stages of panic. They all knew that what they were watching wasn't just a PR nightmare, it was a fundamental failure of their entire system. Elijah stood quietly by the screen, his presence a reminder of everything they had chosen to ignore, every report they had dismissed, every complaint they had buried. The Manhattan lights continued to twinkle beyond the windows, oblivious to the earthquake taking place in the boardroom, as the full weight of what they were witnessing settled over the assembled executives like a heavy shroud. The screens flickered as Elijah pressed another button on the console. The footage disappeared, replaced by a series of detailed personnel profiles. Each one contained a photo, employment history, and a long list of documented incidents labeled as infractions and microaggression markers. Karen Delaney's profile appeared first. Her employee photo showed her standard flight attendant smile, but now it seemed hollow against the scrolling list of complaints beside it. Incident reports, passenger grievances, and HR notes filled the screen, each one marked resolved or dismissed in small red text. December 2022, Elijah read aloud, his voice steady. Passenger in 14C reported discriminatory service, dismissed due to insufficient evidence. He swiped to the next entry. March 2023, 3 separate complaints about selective enforcement of carry-on policies, all marked resolved without investigation. Leslie Morgan's profile followed. Similar patterns emerged, complaints buried, witnesses discouraged, problems swept away. Then came Jamal Peterson's file, showing how he had enabled and covered for his colleagues' behavior. The gate agent's profile completed the set, revealing a systematic pattern of discrimination in boarding procedures. Bernard Knox shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "These are personnel matters," he said, trying to sound authoritative. "There are proper channels." "The proper channels failed," Elijah cut in, his words sharp but controlled. "They failed because you designed them to fail." He touched the screen again, bringing up internal HR documents. Emails between department heads showed conscious decisions to bury complaints. Meeting minutes revealed discussions about maintaining plausible deniability. Training documents emphasized discretion over accountability. Patricia Chen leaned forward, her legal training evident in her careful choice of words. "Mr. Ward, while these incidents are concerning, we need to consider the broader implications. The union agreements alone." "They're all terminated," Elijah announced, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Effective immediately. Legal indemnity revoked." The statement hit the room like a thunderbolt. Several board members began speaking at once, their voices overlapping in a chorus of objections. "You can't just... The unions will... The media coverage?" Marcus Thompson raised his voice above the others. "The backlash could be devastating. We need to think about the shareholders, the company's reputation." "Reputation?" Elijah's question silenced the room. He turned to face them fully, his expression unchanged but his eyes intense. "You were more worried about lawsuits than human decency. I'm done waiting." Sarah Williams, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "At least let us handle this internally through proper procedures. We can implement new training programs, diversity initiatives." "Like the ones you've been promising for the past decade?" Elijah asked. He pulled up another document on the screen, a series of diversity commitments dating back years, each one unfulfilled or abandoned. Before anyone could respond, Elijah reached into his suit jacket and withdrew a sealed envelope. The paper was thick, expensive, marked with legal watermarks and multiple signatures. He placed it carefully on the glass table where it seemed to command attention like a loaded weapon. "The Code Gray Directive," he announced, watching as recognition dawned on some faces and confusion on others. "My private division, established when I stepped down as CEO. Full access to monitor staff behavior through anonymous testing, loyalty audits, and live bias simulations." Bernard Knox's face reddened. "You've been spying on our employees?" "I've been protecting our passengers," Elijah corrected, "and documenting the failure of leadership that made it necessary." He opened the envelope, removing a stack of papers. "The purge begins now." James Rodriguez, the HR head, found his voice. "A purge? That's rather dramatic, isn't it? We're talking about a few isolated incidents." "Isolated?" Elijah pressed another button and the screens filled with hundreds of similar incidents, each documented, dated, and categorized. "This isn't about a few bad actors. This is about a system that protects them." The board members stared at the overwhelming evidence before them. The sheer volume of documented cases made it impossible to dismiss as anomalous behavior or coincidence. This was systematic, ingrained, and deliberately overlooked. Patricia Chen studied the Code Gray document with growing concern. This gives you unilateral authority for personnel decisions? That can't be legal. It was made legal, Elijah replied, by this board, when you thought I was leaving, when you assumed the power would rest in your hands. He gestured to the signatures at the bottom of the document, their own names dated months ago. The realization of their position began to sink in. They had approved this measure themselves, never imagining it would be used against the very system they had built to protect themselves. Sarah Williams picked up the document with trembling hands. "This is beyond termination," she said, scanning the text. "This revokes all legal protection from the company for discriminatory actions. They'd be personally liable." "As they should be," Elijah stated, "as should everyone who enabled them." The implications of that statement weren't lost on anyone in the room. Several board members unconsciously touched their own lapels or adjusted their ties, suddenly aware of their own vulnerability. Marcus Thompson tried one last objection. "The unions will fight this. The media coverage alone could tank our stock." "The unions have already been briefed," Elijah interrupted. "They've reviewed the evidence. They understand that defending these actions would destroy their own credibility." He paused, letting that sink in. "As for the media, which would you prefer? A story about decisive action against discrimination, or one about systematic cover-ups at the highest levels?" The room fell silent again. The Manhattan lights continued to sparkle beyond the windows, but inside, the atmosphere was heavy with the weight of unavoidable change. The board members looked at each other, then at the evidence still displayed on the screens, then at the Code Gray document that had sealed their fate. Elijah stood quietly, watching as the reality of the situation settled over the room. The carefully constructed system of deniability and deflection that they had built over years was crumbling before their eyes. The power they had thought was firmly in their grasp was slipping through their fingers like sand. He pressed one final button on the console. New documents appeared on the screens, termination notices, legal disclaimers, public statements, all ready to be implemented. The machine he had built was already in motion, its gears turning inexorably toward a conclusion that none of them could stop. "The purge," he repeated, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "begins now." The warehouse sat inconspicuously in an industrial district of Queens, its weathered exterior giving no hint of the sophisticated operation within. Inside, the space hummed with activity, transformed into a high-tech command center that monitored Skyloom's entire fleet. Banks of screens lined the walls, displaying real-time data from hundreds of flights crisscrossing the country. At the main monitoring station, Sarah Chen adjusted her headset and zoomed in on Flight 2187, currently somewhere over Kansas. Through covert cameras, she watched a flight attendant's interaction with passengers in row 14. The attendant's smile remained fixed as she served drinks to a white couple, then noticeably dimmed when addressing the black father seated next to them. "Flag on 2187, Sarah announced, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Discriminatory service pattern, Section C, rows 14 through 17. The incident appeared instantly on the main screen, categorized and time-stamped. Across the room, Michael Rodriguez was tracking Flight 849 from his station. "Adding another," he called out. Korean passenger in first class being repeatedly interrupted and talked over. Flight attendant using exaggerated slow speech despite passengers' clear English. The data wall at the front of the room updated automatically. Red dots appeared on the flight paths, each representing a documented incident. The numbers kept climbing. 168, 169, 170. In the behavioral analysis section, teams of specialists reviewed footage from multiple angles. They noted subtle changes in body language, variations in tone, discrepancies in service quality. Every interaction was rated on a comprehensive scale that measured fairness, respect, and equal treatment. Dr. Amara Wilson, head of behavioral analytics, studied the pattern emerging on her tablet. The frequency is concerning, she noted to her team. We're seeing consistent bias markers across multiple crew members, multiple routes. On one of her screens, a flight attendant was visibly rolling her eyes while a passenger in a hijab tried to explain about her insulin pens. The attendant's voice came through clearly. Ma'am, we have strict rules about liquids. I'm going to need to confiscate these. Medical discrimination, Flight 955, Dr. Wilson logged. Third incident today involving necessary medical supplies. The command center's middle section housed the data analysis team. They processed the incoming information in real time, looking for patterns and systemic issues. Charts and graphs updated continuously, showing breakdowns by route, crew member, time of day, and passenger demographics. Getting another cluster on the East Coast routes, announced James Park, lead data analyst. He highlighted a series of red flags appearing along the Boston, D.C. corridor. Multiple reports of selective enforcement of baggage policies, non-white passengers being targeted for carry-on checks at 3 times the normal rate. The incidents continued to accumulate. A black father was denied headphones because they were for premium guests only, despite being clearly available to all passengers. Minutes later, the same flight attendant freely distributed headphones to white passengers in the same section. On another flight, a Korean elder struggled with seat adjustment instructions. Instead of offering assistance, the crew member made exaggerated gestures and spoke in a mock accent, drawing laughs from nearby staff. The passenger's dignity crumbled visibly on the screen. In the west wing of the facility, the legal team documented each incident meticulously. Every interaction was categorized, cross-referenced, and added to growing case files. The evidence would be irrefutable. High-definition video, crystal-clear audio, timestamps, and multiple witnesses. From his position on the upper level, Elijah Ward observed it all in silence. His arms were folded across his chest as he watched the data wall's growing constellation of red flags. Each dot represented not just an incident, but a person, someone whose dignity had been compromised, whose humanity had been diminished. The numbers kept climbing: 171, 172, 173. Lisa Torres, his chief assistant, approached with a tablet displaying the latest analytics. "Sir," she said quietly, "the incident rate is significantly higher than our initial projections. We're seeing systematic patterns across all routes, all crew levels." Elijah nodded slowly, his expression unchanged. The heat map on the main screen told the story, points of light representing racist incidents illuminating the country's flight paths like a web of shame. "It's not just a few bad actors," Lisa continued. "The data suggests this is deeply embedded in the company culture. We're seeing similar patterns even among newly trained staff." "Let it all come to light," Elijah replied, his voice steady but determined. "We fix this from the roots." Below them, the command center continued its work. Analysts logged new incidents, behavioral experts documented patterns, and legal teams built their cases. The heat map grew brighter, each new point of light revealing another facet of an epidemic that had gone unchecked for too long. The warehouse buzzed with purpose, hundreds of people working in concert to expose what had been hidden in plain sight. On the screens, flights continued their paths across the country, each one now under the watchful eye of those determined to bring change to the skies. In the quiet solitude of his Manhattan penthouse, Elijah Ward sat cross-legged on the polished hardwood floor of his private study. The setting sun cast long shadows through floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the room in amber hues. Around him, hundreds of files lay spread out in precise, methodical arrangements, each one a testament to the systemic racism that plagued Skyloom Airlines. The room's usual minimalist aesthetic had given way to carefully organized chaos. Manila folders formed concentric circles around him, each ring representing different categories of incidents. The inner circle contained the most egregious cases: direct discrimination, verbal abuse, wrongful removals from flights. The outer rings held subtle microaggressions, passive-aggressive service denials, and systematic boarding mistakes. Elijah's fingers moved swiftly across his laptop keyboard, his photographic memory allowing him to reference incidents without constantly checking the physical files. He had been working for 16 straight hours, fueled by green tea and determination. The steady tap of keys punctuated the room's silence as he compiled the most comprehensive audit of airline discrimination ever conducted. The report took shape section by section. Under demographics, he detailed how passengers of color were 3 times more likely to be questioned about their tickets, 5 times more likely to be accused of seat violations, and 8 times more likely to be denied standard services. The data was irrefutable, backed by hundreds of hours of video footage and thousands of documented incidents. In the behavioral patterns section, Elijah categorized the various forms of discrimination. There were the overt actions, flight attendants like Karen Delaney, who openly displayed their prejudices. But more insidious were the subtle patterns, the slight delays in service, the extra scrutiny of carry-on bags, the random security checks that somehow always targeted people of color. The regional analysis revealed that no part of Skyloom's network was immune. From major hubs to smaller regional routes, the same patterns emerged. Some regions showed higher concentrations of incidents, but the underlying culture of discrimination persisted everywhere. The repeat offenders section was particularly damning. Elijah had identified over 200 crew members with multiple documented incidents. Many had received promotions despite having discrimination complaints in their files. Others had been quietly transferred to different routes when issues arose, allowing the cycle to continue. As the evening deepened, Elijah reviewed the victim testimonials. Each one had been carefully anonymized to protect the individuals, but their experiences rang with painful authenticity. A black executive denied access to the first-class lounge despite his platinum status. A Muslim family separated during boarding for random checks that caused them to miss their flight. An elderly Asian couple mocked by crew members who thought they couldn't understand English. After 7 days of intense compilation, Elijah finally typed the title that would send shockwaves through the industry. The Black Box Report: Racial Culture Inside Skyloom. The name was deliberately chosen. Like an aircraft's black box, this report would reveal the ugly truths that had been hidden from view. The executive summary took shape under his fingers. Not one bad apple. A diseased orchard. The metaphor was simple but powerful, addressing the common excuse used to dismiss racial incidents as isolated events. The evidence proved otherwise. This was a systemic issue that had infected every level of the organization. The report structure was meticulous. Video stills showed clear examples of discriminatory behavior, each annotated with timestamps and context. Transcripts of crew interactions revealed patterns of coded language and selective enforcement of policies. Statistical analyses demonstrated undeniable disparities in treatment based on race. The staff response data was particularly revealing. When confronted with evidence of their behavior, many crew members deflected responsibility or claimed ignorance. Others justified their actions through thinly veiled stereotypes and assumptions. The responses painted a picture of deeply ingrained biases that many refused to acknowledge. Elijah included an appendix of recommended actions, concrete steps to address the systemic issues. These ranged from mandatory bias training and revised hiring practices to new oversight mechanisms and clear consequences for discriminatory behavior. Each recommendation was backed by data showing its potential impact. As midnight approached, Elijah reviewed the completed report one final time. The document represented months of undercover work, weeks of data analysis, and countless hours of compilation. It was more than just a report. It was a mirror forcing the industry to confront its reflection. With methodical precision, Elijah created an encrypted backup copy and uploaded it to a secure external server. He then prepared the digital distribution, carefully selecting the recipients who would receive this damning evidence. The first copies went to the Skyloom board, the same people who had dismissed concerns about discrimination for years. Next, he sent copies to his legal team, knowing they would need time to prepare for the inevitable battles ahead. Finally, he distributed the report to trusted CEO allies in other aviation companies, knowing that systemic change would require industry-wide acknowledgement and action. Just as he finished the distribution, His phone buzzed on the hardwood floor beside him. The screen displayed a name he had been expecting: Victor Reyes, Global Air CEO. Elijah picked up the phone, his voice steady and determined as he answered. "Tell the others," he said simply. "Summit's in 2 days. Lock the doors when they arrive." 2 days later, a convoy of luxury vehicles wound their way through the forested roads of an exclusive estate north of Manhattan. The autumn leaves created a colorful canopy over the winding private drive, their rich hues matching the deep blacks and silvers of the high-end cars making their way to the secluded property. A sleek Bentley led the procession, followed by a Mercedes Maybach, a Rolls-Royce Phantom, an Aston Martin, and a Range Rover autobiography. Each vehicle carried one of aviation's most powerful figures, CEOs whose combined companies controlled over 60% of American air travel. The cars passed through 3 separate security checkpoints before reaching the main building, a modernist masterpiece of glass and stone nestled against the hillside. Private security personnel, dressed in dark suits with earpieces, directed each vehicle to designated parking spots. Victor Reyes emerged first from the Bentley, adjusting his Italian silk tie with practiced precision. His carefully maintained silver hair caught the morning light as he surveyed the property with appreciation. From the Mercedes stepped Brenda Monroe, her tailored navy suit and commanding presence marking her as North Sky's formidable leader. Anton Keller of Aerolux exited the Rolls-Royce, his Swiss accent carrying across the courtyard as he spoke quietly into his phone. Devon Cho from Tri-Wing emerged from the Aston Martin, tablet in hand, already reviewing market projections. Finally, Daniel Marks of Sky Stratus stepped out of the Range Rover, his arrogant demeanor evident in every movement. The group was escorted through the building's sophisticated security system, retinal scans, fingerprint readers, and weight-sensitive floor panels that could detect unauthorized movement. They arrived at a conference room that exemplified discreet luxury: hand-carved mahogany table, butter-soft leather chairs, and state-of-the-art presentation technology seamlessly integrated into the decor. "This must have cost a fortune," Daniel remarked, running his hand along the table's polished surface. "Though I suppose that's the point, isn't it? To impress us?" A uniformed server appeared with a silver tray of champagne flutes, each filled with vintage Dom Perignon. The CEOs accepted their glasses, falling into comfortable conversation about market shares and quarterly projections. They arranged themselves around the table, each claiming their unofficial territories through positioning. "The new code-share agreement could revolutionize our routing efficiency," Victor said, swirling his champagne. "Imagine the possibilities with our combined networks." "Not to mention the profit margins," added Brenda, her eyes gleaming. "The savings in operational costs alone." The door opened silently, and Elijah Ward stepped into the room. His presence commanded immediate attention, though he hadn't made a sound. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, but his demeanor carried none of the artificial polish of his guests. He moved with quiet purpose, closing and locking the door behind him. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth as he observed the gathered executives. "You're not here to expand," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room. "You're here to face yourselves." Before anyone could respond, Elijah pressed a button on a discreet remote. The room's lighting dimmed, and a massive screen descended from the ceiling. The black box report's title page appeared, its simple design belying the devastating contents within. "What is this?" Daniel demanded, setting his champagne down with enough force to slosh liquid onto the table. Elijah didn't answer. Instead, he began playing clips, dozens of them, from every airline represented in the room. The footage was damning. A global Airgate agent mocking an Indian passenger's accent, a North Sky flight attendant accidentally spilling coffee on a black passenger's laptop, an Aerolux crew member demanding a Hispanic family change seats for weight distribution, a Tri-Wing supervisor ignoring harassment complaints from Middle Eastern travelers, a Sky Stratus employee calling security on an Asian couple for suspicious behavior. They were simply reading their boarding passes. The room grew increasingly tense as the evidence mounted. Victor's usually composed face had gone pale. Brenda gripped her armrests so tightly her knuckles whitened. Anton's usual smugness had vanished. Devon stared at the floor, unable to watch. Daniel's face had turned an angry red. "This is ridiculous," Daniel finally burst out, trying to laugh but achieving only a strained bark. "These are isolated incidents taken out of context. You can't possibly—" "My legal team will hear about this immediately," Anton interrupted, reaching for his phone. Elijah raised his hand slightly and the screen changed to display complex financial charts and ownership diagrams. "That won't be necessary," he said calmly. "I hold controlling interest across your companies, every single one, through silent trusts, equity trades, and proxy boards." The revelation hit the room like a physical force. Victor dropped his champagne flute, sending glass and liquid across the polished floor. Brenda's carefully maintained composure cracked, her mouth falling open in shock. Anton's phone slipped from his fingers. Devon slumped in his chair, the blood draining from his face. Daniel shot to his feet, his chair toppling backward. "Impossible," Daniel sputtered. "My family has controlled Sky Stratus for 3 generations. There's no way." 48 hours, Elijah cut in, his voice still measured but carrying absolute authority. "You have 2 choices. Resign and hand power to reform boards, or face public exposure. Every clip, every complaint, every cover-up, released to major media outlets, plus full legal action, both criminal and civil." Before any of them could respond, Elijah turned and walked to the door. He paused for a moment, his hand on the handle. "Your time starts now." He stepped through the doorway and locked it from the outside. The sound of the lock engaging seemed to break the shocked silence. The room erupted into chaos. Daniel began pounding on the door, shouting threats. Victor tried calling his lawyers, only to find no signal. Brenda attempted to access the room's security panel, but the controls were dead. Anton paced frantically, muttering in German. Devon sat motionless, staring at the ownership diagrams still displayed on the screen. Their voices blended into a cacophony of anger, fear, and desperation, all contained behind the soundproof walls of their luxurious prison. The morning sun cast long shadows through the estate's windows as security personnel unlocked the conference room door. The 5 CEOs emerged, disheveled and exhausted from their night of confinement. Their once pristine appearances had crumbled, ties loosened, shirts wrinkled, and faces marked by stress and sleeplessness. Dark circles rimmed their eyes, and the confident postures they'd maintained in boardrooms across the world now sagged with defeat. Brenda Monroe was the first to break. Without a word to her colleagues, she pulled out her phone and began dictating her resignation letter to her executive assistant. Her voice trembled slightly, but her words were clear and decisive. The weight of everything she'd witnessed overnight seemed to press down on her shoulders as she spoke. Within 20 minutes, she had transmitted her formal resignation to North Sky's board of directors, ending a 15-year career built on compromises she could no longer defend. Devon Cho followed shortly after, his usually confident demeanor replaced by quiet resignation. He sat in a leather armchair in the estate's lobby, drafting his letter on his tablet. His fingers moved quickly across the screen, as if racing to finish before he could change his mind. Occasionally, he paused to stare into space, the reality of his situation sinking in with each word he typed. Daniel Marks, despite his earlier bluster, was the third to submit his resignation. His face was ashen as he sent the email that would end his family's 3-generation control of Sky Stratus. The legacy he'd been so proud of now crumbled beneath the weight of truth. Victor Reyes, however, maintained his composure. He straightened his tie, smoothed his hair, and requested a meeting with Elijah. There must be room for discussion, he insisted to Elijah's assistant, his voice carrying the smooth confidence that had charmed investors for years. Every business situation has flexibility. Let's talk numbers, strategies, gradual transitions. His smile never reached his eyes as he tried to negotiate his way out of accountability. Anton Keller took a different approach entirely. The Aerolux CEO's face had turned an alarming shade of red as he paced the lobby, shouting into his phone in a mix of English and German. Spittle flew from his lips as his voice echoed off the marble floors. "This is corporate terrorism," he bellowed. "I'll have every financial newspaper in Europe running stories about this insider intimidation by tomorrow morning." His free hand gestured wildly, as if he could physically push away the consequences bearing down on him. Elijah's response came swiftly, but not in the form of a meeting or a counter-threat. At precisely 2:15 p.m., federal agents arrived at Aerolux's New York offices. They carried boxes of financial documents and hard drives that Elijah's team had meticulously compiled over the previous months. Employees watched in stunned silence as agents moved through the executive floor with purposeful efficiency. The evidence was overwhelming. Keller had been running a sophisticated scheme of stock manipulation, diverting executive bonus funds into private accounts, and systematically demoting or firing employees who questioned his practices. The paper trail stretched back years, each document another nail in his professional coffin. The agents found him still at the estate, attempting to delete files from his laptop. They led him out in handcuffs, his threats having dissolved into pale silence, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. Victor Reyes watched Keller's arrest with growing unease but maintained his position. He loosened his collar slightly, the only visible sign of his discomfort. "This is different," he assured his remaining assistant, his voice lower than usual. "I've done nothing illegal. Ward has nothing on me except unsubstantiated claims about customer service issues." He checked his watch repeatedly, calculating his next move. His confidence lasted exactly 47 minutes. At 3:02 p.m., every member of Global Air's board of directors received an email containing years of Victor's private communications. The messages revealed a pattern of calculated discrimination masked as business strategy. In one memo, he had written, "These diversity initiatives are just PR band-aids. Our real problem is these PR hazards who keep complaining about our perfectly reasonable security measures." Another email advised, "Route the budget travelers through Terminal C. Keep our premium passengers away from the riffraff." His true character emerged in every callous line, every dismissive phrase. The most damaging message was a response to a discrimination complaint. If they can't afford first class, they shouldn't expect first-class treatment. Let them fly with their own kind. The words he'd typed so casually now stood as testimony to the contempt he'd hidden behind corporate smiles. Victor's phone began buzzing incessantly with notifications. His face, which had maintained its practiced calm throughout the night, finally cracked. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead as he watched helplessly as Global Air's stock price began to drop, each notification a hammer blow to the career he'd built. By late afternoon, trading of Skyloom shares had been temporarily suspended due to volatile market activity. Emergency board meetings were called across all 5 airlines. In Global Air's headquarters, IT staff scrambled to contain the damage, desperately trying to delete potentially damaging HR files and internal communications. Panic spread through corporate offices like wildfire as employees realized the ground beneath them was shifting. In his command center, Elijah watched the chaos unfold on multiple screens. His assistant entered with a status update. Global Air's servers are being purged. They're trying to eliminate evidence of systematic discrimination. The screens showed frantic activity across networks as desperate executives tried to hide their tracks. Elijah nodded calmly, gesturing to a bank of secure servers humming quietly in the corner. Every file, every email, every deleted complaint, we have it all. Multiple copies, stored in multiple locations. His voice was soft but carried absolute certainty. He'd planned for this moment with the precision that had built his empire. "Sir," the assistant reported, checking their monitoring systems, "the collapse has begun. All 5 airlines are in crisis mode. Their stocks are falling, board members are calling emergency sessions, and the media is starting to pick up the story." News alerts flashed across screens, each one spreading the story further. Elijah stood at the window watching the setting sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. His reflection in the glass showed no satisfaction, no triumph, only quiet determination. "No more cover-ups," he said softly. "They'll either reform or rot." The words hung in the air, a simple truth after years of complexity. The screens behind him continued to flash with updates, resignation announcements, stock prices, news alerts. The carefully constructed facade of 5 of the world's largest airlines was crumbling, revealing the rot that had festered beneath their polished surface. What would rise from these ashes remained to be seen, but for the first time in years, the possibility of real change glimmered on the horizon. 3 days after the airline industry's upheaval, Skyloom's headquarters stood eerily quiet. The usual bustle of corporate activity had been replaced by a tense stillness. In the main atrium, where employees once rushed between meetings, only security personnel and a handful of vetted administrative staff remained. The polished marble floors echoed with each footstep, amplifying the uncomfortable silence that had settled over the once thriving corporate hub. Elijah Ward moved through the building with purposeful steps, his presence drawing nervous glances from the few employees still allowed on premises. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the anxiety permeating the air around him. The company-wide review had thrown thousands of workers into uncertainty. From senior management to ground crew, everyone's position was now under scrutiny. Whispers followed in his wake, a mixture of fear and grudging respect. In the executive boardroom, transformed into a temporary command center, Elijah surveyed his newly assembled leadership team. The large mahogany table that once hosted power lunches and corporate deals now displayed multiple screens and data charts. Dr. Sarah Chen, a renowned behavioral psychologist, sat reviewing applicant profiles on her tablet, her brow furrowed in concentration. Beside her, Marcus Thompson, a veteran DEI consultant with 20 years of experience in corporate reform, organized simulation parameters for the reapplication process, occasionally making notes in his digital planner. Dr. Amara Okafor, an ethical compliance expert, fine-tuned the AI algorithms that would help screen candidates, her fingers dancing across her keyboard with practiced precision. Gone were the old faces of corporate power, the golf-playing executives, the legacy hires, the network-promoted managers who had built careers on connections rather than competence. In their place sat experts chosen for their understanding of human behavior, ethical leadership, and systemic change. The contrast couldn't have been more striking. Where there had once been uniformity, there was now diversity. Where there had been complacency, there was now purpose. "The identity-blind screening protocols are ready," Dr. Chen announced, pulling up a detailed framework on the main screen. The complex flowchart illuminated the darkened room with a blue glow. Each candidate will undergo a 3-phase evaluation process. No names, no photos, no demographic information visible to evaluators. We've eliminated every possible avenue for bias in the initial screening. Elijah nodded, examining the protocol outline with his characteristic attention to detail. His eyes scanned each parameter, each safeguard. "And the audio interviews?" he asked, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable authority. Marcus Thompson stepped forward, gesturing to a sophisticated audio setup nestled in the corner of the room. "Voice modulation technology will standardize all vocal patterns. Evaluators will focus purely on content, problem-solving ability, and ethical reasoning. We've tested it extensively. Even I couldn't tell the difference between speakers of different backgrounds." The behavioral simulations formed the heart of the new screening process. In a dedicated testing center 2 floors below, virtual reality stations had been set up to run candidates through realistic scenarios. The room hummed with technology, each station calibrated to capture the subtlest of responses. Each simulation was designed to reveal implicit biases and test response patterns under pressure, creating situations where true character would inevitably surface. Dr. Okafor demonstrated one such simulation on a monitor, her fingers deftly navigating through the program interface. "Here's Scenario 14, she explained, pride evident in her voice. "A first-class cabin setting with deliberately diverse passenger profiles. We monitor everything: body language, tone, response time, word choice, even micro-expressions that last less than 1/5 of a second." The team watched as a test simulation played out on the high-definition screen. A virtual flight attendant interacted with passengers of various backgrounds, each presenting different needs and challenges. Some requested special meals. Others needed assistance with luggage, while one passenger complained about their seat assignment. The AI system tracked every interaction, flagging problematic responses and behavioral patterns with yellow and red indicators that appeared in the corner of the screen. "The conflict resolution drills are particularly revealing," Marcus added, switching to another scenario with a few taps on his tablet. "We've programmed hundreds of variations, drawing from actual reported incidents. This is where we see who people really are when they think no one important is watching." In this simulation, a candidate faced an angry passenger, while other travelers filmed the interaction on their phones. The virtual environment perfectly recreated the pressure cooker atmosphere of a real confrontation. The system analyzed how the employee handled the pressure, checking for bias in their conflict management approach, and noting whether they treated different types of passengers with equal respect and patience. The results from the first round of testing painted a stark picture that hung heavily in the room. Of the initial applicant pool, only 18% demonstrated the necessary combination of professional competence and unbiased behavior. The majority showed concerning patterns of discrimination, often so ingrained they seemed unaware of their own biases. The data visualization on screen showed a sea of red flags, each representing a moment where a candidate had failed to meet the new standard. Elijah moved between testing stations, observing candidates as they underwent evaluation. Through one-way glass, he watched their expressions change as they navigated the challenges. Some grew defensive when faced with their own biased responses, their faces flushing with indignation. Others broke down, tears welling in their eyes as they realized how their unconscious prejudices had affected their work. A few showed genuine potential for growth, demonstrating the ability to recognize and correct their problematic behaviors with humility and determination. The bias recognition training proved particularly challenging for many applicants. Embedded within realistic scenarios, these tests required candidates to identify and appropriately respond to various forms of discrimination happening around them. Many failed to recognize subtle forms of bias, their expressions blank as they missed clear warning signs. Others showed an alarming tendency to justify discriminatory practices as standard procedure, their rationalizations revealing deeply entrenched problematic thinking. In one of the observation rooms, Elijah watched as the AI system flagged a concerning interaction, red warning symbols flashing urgently on the monitor. A former gate manager, participating in a simulation involving a disabled black passenger, displayed casual cruelty in his response. The candidate's dismissive tone and mocking facial expressions were subtle but clear, the kind of behavior that might have once gone unnoticed or unreported, allowing toxic culture to fester unchecked. The simulation showed the virtual passenger requesting assistance with boarding, his voice polite but firm. The gate manager's response seemed professional on the surface, but the AI detected multiple red flags: unnecessary delays in providing help, condescending tone variations, and negative micro-expressions when the passenger asked questions. Each transgression was highlighted on the screen, creating a damning record of bias. Dr. Chen, who had joined Elijah in the observation room, shook her head as she reviewed the data scrolling across her tablet. The soft blue light illuminated her concerned expression. The system caught 8 distinct instances of biased behavior in just this one interaction. The candidate doesn't even seem aware of their prejudicial conduct. It's so normalized for him that he can't see what he's doing. Elijah watched the footage once more, his expression unchanged but his eyes reflecting a deep disappointment. The casual nature of the discrimination, how easily it flowed from someone in a position of responsibility, confirmed the depth of the problem he was fighting. This wasn't just about a few bad actors. This was about an entire culture that needed transformation. Without hesitation, he closed the laptop, displaying the simulation footage with a gentle but decisive click. His voice was quiet but firm as he pronounced judgment. Disqualify. Permanently. The words hung in the air, weighted with finality. The candidate's profile immediately shifted to the growing list of rejected applications, joining hundreds of others marked with bright red "Do Not Rehire" tags. The list grew longer each hour, a digital testament to the scope of the problem and the uncompromising nature of the new standards. On the large monitor at the front of the room, the percentage of qualified candidates continued to shrink, a sobering reminder of how much work lay ahead. The morning sun painted streaks of gold across the private hangar at JFK International Airport. Through the massive doors, a new aircraft gleamed in the early light, its metallic gray fuselage catching the dawn's rays. The plane stood as a testament to change, its clean lines and minimalist design a stark contrast to the flashy liveries of traditional carriers. On its tail, in understated silver lettering, was the name Equitas Air. There was no red carpet, no champagne, no corporate fanfare. The usual trappings of an airline launch were notably absent. Instead, a small group of crew members moved with quiet purpose around the aircraft, performing their pre-flight checks with meticulous attention to detail. Each of them had emerged from the rigorous reform program, not just qualified, but transformed. The ground crew, dressed in charcoal uniforms with subtle silver accents, worked in synchronized efficiency. They represented a carefully selected team, every member having passed not just technical evaluations but comprehensive ethical assessments. Their interactions showed a natural respect for each other, regardless of role or background. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere carried a sense of calm professionalism. The interior design spoke of thoughtful inclusion. Seats were adjusted for various body types, signage appeared in multiple languages, and the entertainment systems featured diverse content options. Even the safety cards had been redesigned to show a range of passengers, ensuring everyone could see themselves represented. Flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced grace, their training evident in every interaction. The crew reflected the diversity of the passengers they would serve, different races, ages, and backgrounds working together seamlessly. Their new uniforms were designed for both comfort and dignity, free from the outdated stereotypes that had once defined airline fashion. Soraya Jennings stood near the front galley, reviewing the flight manifest one final time. Her journey from social worker to flight attendant had been unconventional, but her background in trauma-informed care made her uniquely qualified for Equitas Air's mission. She understood that every passenger interaction was an opportunity to demonstrate genuine respect and care. The boarding process began quietly, each crew member taking their positions. There were no arbitrary zones, no subtle hierarchies in how passengers were welcomed aboard. Everyone received the same warm, professional greeting. The passengers themselves were a test group, employees from various departments, safety officials, and aviation authorities who would evaluate every aspect of the new airline's operations. Elijah Ward arrived last, dressed simply in a gray sweater and dark slacks. He carried a small leather bag and moved unhurriedly toward the aircraft. His choice of seat 17B, a middle seat in the rear section, was deliberate. It was the same seat assignment that had sparked his undercover investigation months ago. As he approached the entrance, Soraya knelt slightly to meet his eye level, a small but significant gesture that spoke volumes about the new culture she embodied. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Ward," she said warmly. "Thank you for flying with us." Her voice carried genuine appreciation, free from the artificial cheeriness that often characterized airline greetings. Elijah's smile in response was real, a rare, unguarded moment for a man who had spent months maintaining a stern facade of reform. In Soraya's greeting, he saw his vision taking shape, genuine respect replacing forced politeness, true inclusion instead of tokenism. Moving through the cabin, Elijah noted how different the atmosphere felt. Passengers were treated with equal attention, regardless of their seating assignment. The crew moved with confidence, their training evident in how they anticipated and addressed needs before they arose. There was no hint of the biased behavior that had once plagued the industry. As he settled into his seat, Elijah observed the subtle but significant changes in service delivery. The crew's language was carefully chosen to be inclusive, yet natural. Their body language remained open and welcoming to all passengers. Even the way they positioned themselves while speaking showed careful consideration for passenger comfort and dignity. The pre-flight procedures proceeded smoothly. Safety demonstrations were clear and accessible, with multiple communication methods ensuring every passenger could understand the information. The crew moved through their checks with precision, their professionalism enhanced by their genuine commitment to passenger well-being. As the engines hummed to life and the aircraft began its taxi, Elijah gazed out the window at the rising sun. The vibration of his phone drew his attention, On the screen, a text message appeared from a familiar name, Karen Delaney. Her words glowed harsh and bitter. "You destroyed my life." Without hesitation or emotion, Elijah deleted the message. His focus returned to the window as the aircraft lifted smoothly into the morning sky. Below, the sprawling airport grew smaller, its maze of runways and terminals fading into the landscape. Aquitas Air climbed steadily through the clear blue sky, carrying with it the promise of a transformed industry. The aircraft banked gently, catching the sunlight on its wings as it rose above the clouds. In the cabin, Soraya moved efficiently through her duties, embodying the principles that would define this new chapter in aviation. The plane continued its ascent, leaving behind not just the ground, but the entrenched prejudices that had for too long poisoned the skies. 2 weeks after Aquitas Air's first flight, the quiet revolution in the skies began to take shape. No flashy advertisements decorated airport terminals, no promotional emails flooded inboxes, and no celebrity endorsements graced social media. Instead, something more powerful emerged, the authentic voices of passengers sharing their experiences. On Twitter, a thread from a Muslim woman named Amira gained traction. She described her recent Aquitas flight with a mix of surprise and relief. "No one stared when I adjusted my hijab, no random security checks. The flight attendant even knew how to properly pronounce my name. I actually felt normal." Her words resonated. Within hours, hundreds of similar stories emerged. A wheelchair user detailed how the crew assisted him with dignity, not dismissive haste. An elderly Korean couple praised the multilingual safety instructions. A black executive expressed his shock at being treated with the same courtesy and economy as his white colleagues in first class. Reddit threads dedicated to air travel began buzzing with discussions. Users shared screenshots of booking confirmations, eager to experience what they called the respect revolution. Travel bloggers who had witnessed the transformation firsthand wrote detailed accounts, their words carrying weight among frequent flyers. "It's not just about what they do differently," wrote one popular travel reviewer. "It's about what's missing, the subtle eye rolls, the impatient sighs, the selective enforcement of rules. Flying shouldn't feel like a battle, and with Aquitas it doesn't." As these positive experiences circulated, a different kind of narrative emerged from the shadows of the old system. Former Skyloom employees, those who hadn't made it through Aquitas Air's stringent screening process, began speaking out. Their stories painted a complex picture of ingrained bias and institutional failure. On industry forums, some ex-employees lashed out defensively. "This is what happens when woke culture takes over," wrote one former supervisor. 20 years of experience means nothing now." Others complained about reverse discrimination and political correctness gone mad. But amid the backlash, more nuanced voices emerged. A former flight attendant named Marcus posted a video that quickly went viral. Sitting in what appeared to be his living room, his uniform hanging visible in the background, he spoke with raw honesty. "We were trained to assume the worst," he admitted, his voice cracking. "Not directly, not in writing, but through countless small moments. If a black passenger asked for an upgrade, we were supposed to scrutinize their status level extra carefully. If someone with an accent complained, we were taught to question if they understood the policy correctly." His hands trembled as he continued. "The worst part? We never questioned it. It was just normal. God, I'm so sorry." The video ended with Marcus wiping tears from his eyes, his former airline wings clutched tightly in his fist. More confessions followed. A gate agent described the unwritten rules for upgrade lists, how non-white names were subtly pushed down. A baggage handler revealed how certain passengers' lost luggage complaints were deliberately delayed. A customer service representative shared screenshots of internal messaging systems where staff would mock passengers' names or accents. Leslie Chen, another former flight attendant, posted a lengthy blog about her awakening. "I'm Asian American, and I still participated in this system," she wrote. "I thought if I played along, if I helped enforce these biases against other minorities, somehow I'd be one of the good ones. It took losing my job and watching Aquitas succeed to realize how deeply I'd compromised myself." The confessions sparked intense online discussions about systemic racism in aviation. Industry watchdogs began investigating other airlines more closely. Passengers started sharing older stories of discrimination, finally feeling validated in their experiences. In his Manhattan apartment, Elijah Ward sat in his home office, multiple screens displaying these unfolding narratives. His posture was straight, but his shoulders carried a visible weight. He watched Marcus's tearful confession again, noting every detail of the former employee's body language and tone. The room was dimly lit, with the city lights creating a soft glow through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Stacks of reports and data analyses covered his desk, each containing metrics tracking Equitas Air's impact. Passenger satisfaction scores, incident reports, demographic data, all pointing to a successful launch. His assistant, Maya, stood quietly by the door, tablet in hand. She had been monitoring the public response since the launch, tracking every mention, every review, every confession. Her latest report showed unprecedented interest in the airline's recruitment portal. "We're seeing a 200% spike in applications," she reported, her voice carrying a note of cautious optimism. "Particularly from underrepresented communities, flight attendants, pilots, ground crew, across all positions." Elijah nodded slowly, but his expression remained heavy. The light from the screens cast shadows across his face, highlighting the subtle lines of concern around his eyes. He watched another confession video play silently, showing a former colleague describing years of normalized discrimination. "Good," he whispered, his voice barely audible. His fingers traced the edge of a report detailing industry-wide discrimination statistics. But it's not enough. The city lights continued to twinkle beyond his windows, and somewhere in the night sky, another Aquitas Air flight carried passengers safely through the darkness, treating each soul aboard with the dignity they deserved. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the parking lot of the Newark Convention Center as Karen Delaney stood among the crowd gathering for the aviation industry job fair. Her blonde hair, usually perfectly styled, hung limply around her face. The navy blue blazer she'd worn countless times during her flying career was wrinkled, as if it had been pulled from the bottom of a laundry pile. Her hands clutched a stack of resumes, the paper already showing signs of nervous creasing at the corners. The crowd moved around her like water around a stone, creating unconscious distance. No one met her gaze, some because they didn't notice her, others because they recognized her all too well. The convention center's glass doors reflected her image, and Karen barely recognized herself. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her makeup couldn't hide the strain of the past months. 4 airlines had already rejected her applications, each response more dismissive than the last. Her flight attendant license remained valid. Technically, she could still work, but the industry's whisper network had done its job. Her name carried warnings now, unspoken but clear. "I'm sorry, we're not hiring at this time," a recruiter said, barely glancing at her resume before sliding it back across the table. "We'll keep your application on file," another promised with a tight smile that didn't reach their eyes. "Your experience is impressive," a third commented, their pause speaking volumes. "But we're looking for candidates who better align with our current culture." Each rejection chipped away at her composure. By noon, Karen's stack of resumes remained largely untouched, and her professional smile had crumbled into a tight-lipped grimace. She watched as other candidates, many with far less experience, walked away with preliminary offers and second interview appointments. The drive back to her apartment felt longer than usual. The check engine light blinked persistently on her dashboard, another problem she couldn't afford to fix. Her thoughts drifted to her savings account, once healthy, now dwindling to dangerous levels. The severance package from Skyloom had barely covered 3 months of expenses. As she climbed the stairs to her one-bedroom apartment, the bright orange paper taped to her door stopped her cold. Final notice of eviction. The words seemed to pulse in her vision, each letter a hammer blow to her already fragile composure. She tore the notice down, hands shaking as she unlocked her door. Inside, the apartment felt smaller than ever. Moving boxes lined one wall. She'd started packing weeks ago, hoping she wouldn't need them. Her phone lay on the kitchen counter where she'd left it, its screen lighting up with notifications. 27 unread messages. Karen scrolled through them, each one making her sink further into her kitchen chair. Former colleagues, people she'd considered friends, responding to her increasingly desperate attempts to network. "Please stop contacting me." "I can't help you, Karen, you know why. What happened at Skyloom was your own doing. Don't message me again." The last one, from Leslie, her former flying partner, stung the most. "You haven't learned anything, have you? Still playing the victim. Get help, Karen." Her vision blurred. She opened her laptop, navigating to the airline job boards she'd been obsessively checking for weeks. The usual listings appeared: regional carriers, charter services, international airlines, all places that had already rejected her. But there at the top of the page was something new. An airline she didn't recognize: Equitas Air. The logo was simple, elegant, a stylized wing in deep gray. The listing described competitive pay, comprehensive benefits, and a revolutionary approach to crew culture. Karen clicked through, her eyebrows rising as she read the application requirements. Anonymous screening processes, behavioral simulations, identity-blind interviews. The whole thing seemed more like a reality show than a legitimate airline. "What is this, a game show?" she muttered, scrolling through the detailed requirements. Behavioral simulations? Anonymous screening? They can't be serious. Her mouse hovered over the close button, but then her eyes drifted to the eviction notice, now crumpled on her counter, to the stack of unpaid bills beside it, to the phone still displaying messages of rejection. With a deep breath that was almost a sigh, Karen began filling out the application. Each section felt strange, stripped of the personal touches she'd always relied on. Her impressive experience, her recommendations, her professional image. The system wouldn't even accept her full name, assigning her a candidate number instead. The process took nearly an hour. When she finally clicked submit, her hands were trembling from more than just fatigue. This wasn't just another application. It felt like surrender. The automated response arrived almost immediately, its cheerful tone seeming to mock her situation. Application received. You have been randomly selected for assessment flight. Passenger role. Location: JFK International Airport. Destination: Chicago O'Hare. Seat 17B, please arrive 2 hours before departure. Karen stared at the screen, her breath catching in her throat. Seat 17B. The same seat where everything had started to unravel. Where that passenger, Elijah Ward, had sat, quietly observing, taking notes, dismantling her entire world with each stroke of his pen. Her hands trembled so violently that her laptop shook on the table. The irony wasn't lost on her. The veteran flight attendant, now assigned to sit where her downfall began. To be watched, evaluated, judged. The screen's glow illuminated her face in the darkening apartment, casting shadows that seemed to dance with cruel amusement at her predicament. Outside, a plane's distant engines rumbled through the evening sky, a sound that had once meant home but now carried the weight of everything she'd lost. Karen Mitchell, the alias she'd chosen for this flight, shuffled through security at JFK International Airport. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed her small carry-on bag on the conveyor belt. The oversized sunglasses she wore felt like a shield, though they drew more attention than they deflected in the fluorescent-lit terminal. Her usually perfect blonde hair was pulled back into a severe bun, every strand controlled, as if trying to become someone else through sheer force of will. Gate C-17 loomed ahead, the same gate number as that fateful flight months ago. Karen's steps faltered for a moment, but she forced herself forward. The gate area was different from what she remembered. The Equitas Air logo, elegant in its simplicity, decorated the walls in muted grays and blues. No flashy advertisements, no promises of luxury or exclusivity. Just clean lines and calm colors. The gate agents worked with quiet efficiency. A young woman in a hijab checked boarding passes while her colleague, a man with graying temples and kind eyes, helped passengers with seating questions. There was no rush, no impatience, just a steady flow of people being treated with equal attention. Karen watched as they processed the boarding groups. No priority lanes, no special treatment, just orderly rows of passengers, each receiving the same courteous nod, the same genuine welcome aboard. When her turn came, Karen held her breath. But the gate agent simply smiled, scanned her pass, and said, "Have a pleasant flight, Ms. Mitchell." No second glances, no extra scrutiny. Karen felt something tight in her chest. Was it relief? Disappointment? She couldn't tell. The jet bridge seemed longer than she remembered. Each step brought her closer to seat 17B, a number that had haunted her dreams for months. As she approached the aircraft door, a flight attendant greeted her with a warm smile. Karen noticed his name tag read Marcus, no last name, just like all the other crew members she'd seen. The cabin interior was different from any she'd worked in. The lighting was soft, natural. The usual harsh divisions between classes were subtle, almost invisible. As she made her way down the aisle, Karen observed the crew in action. Their movements were practiced but unhurried, their interactions genuine. Seat 17B waited for her like a silent judge. Karen stowed her bag with mechanical precision, muscle memory from thousands of flights in a different role, and settled into the middle seat. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. This was where Elijah Ward had sat, watching, evaluating, taking notes that would eventually dismantle her entire world. A young woman with bright eyes took the window seat, while a middle-aged man in a business suit claimed the aisle. Neither gave Karen more than a polite nod before settling into their own routines. As the cabin filled, Karen couldn't help but notice the differences. An elderly Arab man struggled with his carry-on bag near the overhead bin. Without hesitation, 2 crew members, one Asian, one white, rushed to assist him. Their help came with genuine smiles and patient explanations, no hint of the barely concealed irritation she knew she would have shown in their place. A few rows ahead, a black teenager with a pronounced stutter tried to ask about the entertainment system. The flight attendant, a woman with silver-streaked hair, knelt beside his seat, maintaining eye contact, waiting patiently through each difficult word. There was no rush, no finishing his sentences for him, just authentic human connection. "Weird, huh?" the woman by the window suddenly remarked, startling Karen from her observations. "I fly all the time, but this is different. I actually feel respected." She laughed softly, shaking her head. Who knew that could be a thing on an airplane? Karen turned to look out the window, grateful for her sunglasses. The tarmac blurred before her eyes, but she wasn't seeing it. Instead, she saw herself in countless cabins, delivering countless subtle snubs, justified by policies she'd never questioned. The weight of those memories pressed against her chest like a physical thing. The safety demonstration began, another departure from the norm. Instead of the usual recorded video, crew members demonstrated in person, making eye contact with passengers, ensuring understanding through presence rather than performance. Karen watched their movements, recognizing the technical precision but seeing something else too, something she'd forgotten existed in this profession. As the plane reached cruising altitude, a male flight attendant approached their row. He was black, tall, with features that reminded her painfully of Elijah Ward, but where she had seen threat in Elijah's quiet observation, this man's face held only warmth. He knelt down to eye level with her seat, a gesture she had never once considered doing in her 15 years of service. "Welcome aboard, ma'am," he said, extending both hands with a bottle of water. The gesture was deliberate, respectful, almost ceremonial in its simplicity. Karen found herself frozen, staring at his offered hands through her dark glasses. Then he added softly, words that shattered something inside her. "You people deserve kindness too." Karen's face twisted, not with the familiar anger she'd nursed these past months, but with something raw and painful. Recognition. Recognition of herself in every passenger she'd ever dismissed, every subtle cruelty she'd justified, every moment she'd chosen hierarchy over humanity. Her sunglasses couldn't hide the truth anymore. In this simple act of service, this deliberate extension of dignity, she saw everything she had failed to be. The descent into Chicago O'Hare felt different from any landing Karen had experienced before. The gentle bump of wheels touching down used to feel like coming home. Now it felt like a final verdict. She remained seated as other passengers gathered their belongings, her hands folded tightly in her lap, sunglasses still firmly in place despite the cabin's dimness. Her knuckles had turned white from the pressure of her grip, as if holding on to the last shreds of her former life. The deplaning process moved with the same quiet efficiency she'd observed throughout the flight. No rush, no sharp words, no subtle hierarchies, just people moving with purpose and respect. Karen waited until most passengers had filed out before standing on shaky legs to retrieve her carry-on. The familiar routine she'd overseen thousands of times now felt foreign from this side of the experience. As she stepped into the jet bridge, none of the crew made eye contact. There was no hostility in their avoidance. They simply didn't notice her, treating her with the same professional courtesy they'd shown everyone else. Somehow, this felt worse than outright rejection. She had become just another face in the crowd, stripped of the authority she'd wielded for so long. The invisibility stung more than any confrontation could have. The terminal stretched before her, vast and indifferent. Her designer boots, once a symbol of her professional polish, clicked hollowly against the polished floor. She found herself walking without direction, her body moving on autopilot until she spotted a quiet waiting area near gate B15. The bench there seemed to call to her, a place to pause before facing whatever came next. She sank down onto it, feeling the weight of the day, of the past months, pressing down on her shoulders. Karen's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. The email notification had arrived during landing, its subject line stark and official. Humiliates Air Assessment Program. Results. She stared at it for several long moments, her thumb hovering over the screen. Finally, she tapped it open, her heart pounding in her ears like distant thunder. Dear Ms. Mitchell, thank you for participating in our behavioral empathy program. Your engagement in today's assessment flight has been carefully evaluated according to our comprehensive standards for cultural awareness, emotional intelligence, and authentic service delivery. This concludes your assessment. Status: rejected. We appreciate your interest in Humiliates Air. Please note that this decision is final, and we will not be accepting further applications. Regards, Talent Assessment Team, Humiliates Air. The words blurred before her eyes. Karen sat heavily on the bench, her carry-on forgotten at her feet. Her hands moved of their own accord, pulling up an old photo stored in her phone. There she stood, perfectly coiffed in her Skyloom uniform, smile bright and confident beside the company's distinctive logo. The photo had been taken just 6 months ago, though it felt like looking at a stranger from another lifetime. Her smile in the picture seemed so certain, so unaware of what was coming. The uniform had been more than clothes, it had been armor, identity, power. Now that company didn't even exist. The logo had been stripped from planes, terminals, and history itself, erased as thoroughly as her career. All those years of service, all those miles in the sky, gone in an instant like clouds dispersed by wind. Tears began to fall, sliding beneath her sunglasses. They came from a place deeper than anger, though anger was certainly there. Shame burned hot in her chest, mixing with a grief so profound it threatened to hollow her out. Everything she'd built her life around, her certainties, her justifications, her sense of rightness, had crumbled. The foundation she'd stood on for decades had turned to sand beneath her feet. I thought I was just doing my job, she whispered to the stranger in the photo. Her voice caught on the words, recognizing them as the hollow excuse they were. The job had never required cruelty. She had chosen it, justified it, wrapped it in procedure and protocol until it felt normal, until she couldn't see what she had become. The terminal continued its endless flow of humanity around her. Families reuniting, business travelers hurrying past, crew members walking with purpose to their next flights. None of them noticed the woman crying quietly on the bench, and Karen found a strange comfort in her invisibility. For the first time, she understood what it meant to be overlooked. A small sound caught her attention, the clatter of plastic on tile. A few feet away, a child had dropped a toy, a colorful action figure that skittered across the floor to rest near Karen's feet. Without thinking, she reached down and picked it up, her fingers closing around the small plastic hero. The child's mother was already approaching, a black woman in a smart business suit holding her daughter's hand. Karen extended the toy, and their eyes met. In that brief moment, Karen felt the weight of every dismissive glance, every subtle slight she'd ever delivered to women just like this one. The recognition was a physical ache in her chest. But the mother simply nodded politely, accepting the toy with a small "thank you." Her daughter smiled shyly before they turned away, continuing their journey through the terminal. There was no recognition in their eyes, no judgment, just the simple human connection of a small kindness acknowledged. Karen watched them go, tears still trailing down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered, though they were too far away to hear. The words felt different in her mouth, humble, genuine, stripped of the performative politeness she'd wielded like a weapon for so long. Two simple words that carried the weight of a beginning. She stood slowly, gathering her carry-on. Around her, the terminal buzzed with its eternal rhythm. Arrivals, departures, countless stories intersecting and diverging. Karen joined the flow of travelers, just another face in the crowd, moving toward an uncertain future she'd never imagined for herself. For the first time in her life, she had no map, no uniform, no script to follow, just the long road of becoming someone different than she had been. 1 month had passed since Equitas Air's transformation of the skies began taking root. The morning sun cast long shadows across O'Hare International Airport as Elijah Ward made his way through security. He wore simple clothes again, dark jeans, a navy sweater, and his signature glasses, but carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was. The terminal buzzed with its usual morning energy. Travelers rushed past with coffee cups and rolling bags. Flight announcements echoed overhead, and gate agents called out boarding zones. But something was different here now. The atmosphere felt lighter, more open. Elijah noticed small changes that others might miss. The way security officers spoke to everyone with the same professional tone, how gate agents made eye contact with each passenger regardless of appearance. At Gate C-12, an Equitas air flight to New York was preparing to board. The sleek gray aircraft sat outside the window, its minimalist design a stark contrast to the flashy liveries of neighboring planes. Elijah stood back, observing the boarding process with practiced attention to detail. The gate agent, a young Asian woman, called out zones clearly and smiled genuinely at each passenger. When his zone was called, Elijah joined the line. He could have boarded first. The entire airline was, after all, his creation. But that wasn't the point anymore. He waited patiently, watching as elderly passengers and families with young children were assisted with care and respect. The jet bridge felt familiar under his feet. He'd walked this path countless times during his undercover months, each step carrying the weight of observation and purpose. Now these steps felt different, lighter somehow, though no less meaningful. Inside the cabin, Elijah made his way toward the back. Seat 17B waited for him like an old friend. He chose it deliberately, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps it was habit, or maybe something deeper, a reminder of where this journey began. The middle seat that had once been an insult had become a symbol of transformation. A young black family settled into the row ahead of him, the parents helping their toddler with her seatbelt. The flight attendant, a white man in his early 30s, approached them with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard," he said, kneeling to eye level with the little girl. "I love your butterfly hair clips. Would you like to see where we keep the emergency lollipops for extra special passengers?" The child's eyes lit up as the attendant produced a cherry lollipop from his pocket. Her parents exchanged glances, not of surprise or suspicion, but of simple appreciation for genuine kindness. Elijah watched these interactions unfold around him, taking mental notes out of old habit. The crew moved through the cabin with an easy grace, their training evident in every interaction. They offered water to everyone, used honorifics consistently, and responded to requests with the same level of attention regardless of who made them. An elderly white woman across the aisle struggled with her reading light. A black female attendant helped her immediately, patience evident in her gentle explanation. A Muslim man in traditional dress asked for an extra blanket and received one with a smile and "sir." A teenage girl with dark skin requested headphones and was handed them without question or comment about her seat assignment. These weren't extraordinary moments. And that was exactly the point. This was simply service as it should be, stripped of bias and prejudice, delivered with genuine human connection. Elijah reached into his bag and pulled out a leather-bound journal. Its pages held months of observations, incidents, and plans that had led to this moment. He opened to a fresh page, his pen hovering over the crisp paper. Around him, the cabin hummed with pre-flight activity, but he was lost in thought. The words came slowly, deliberately. The seat that once made me invisible became the one that changed everything. Not because I fought, because I watched. He paused, letting the truth of those words sink in. His victory hadn't come from confrontation or force, but from patient observation and strategic action. The very invisibility that others had tried to impose on him had become his greatest tool for change. The plane took off smoothly, climbing through clouds into clear blue skies. Throughout the flight, Elijah continued to observe. He noticed how the crew maintained their professional warmth even when tired, how they handled minor issues with calm efficiency, how passengers seemed more relaxed than he'd ever seen on his previous flights. This wasn't perfection. He could still spot small areas for improvement, moments where service could be refined. But it was conscious, intentional, and fair. It was what he had envisioned when he first conceived of Equitas Air. Not just another airline, but a model for what air travel could be. As the flight began its descent into New York, the cabin lights dimmed slightly. Manhattan's skyline appeared through breaks in the clouds, familiar skyscrapers reaching toward the approaching aircraft. A male flight attendant paused beside Elijah's row, performing final checks. "Is there anything else I can get you, Mr.?" The question was genuine, without a trace of recognition. Elijah looked up from his journal, a small smile crossing his face. This moment, being treated just like any other passenger, meant more than any executive privilege ever had. "No," he replied softly, closing his journal. "I have everything I need." Through the window, the clouds parted completely, revealing the city in all its morning glory. The Hudson River caught the sunlight, gleaming like a silver ribbon between the buildings. As the wheels prepared to touch down, Elijah watched the approaching runway with quiet satisfaction. 2 days after the flight, Elijah Ward stood in the modest auditorium of the Greater New York Aviation Academy. The space was intimate, just large enough for about 100 people, with worn wooden seats and walls covered in vintage aviation posters. No press badges glinted in the audience, no cameras flashed. This moment wasn't for headlines. Instead, the room held a carefully selected group: aviation instructors, community leaders, and most importantly, 20 young faces filled with hope and determination. These were the first recipients of what Elijah had named the 17B Initiative, a comprehensive scholarship program designed to transform the aviation industry from the ground up. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting warm rectangles across the scuffed floor. Elijah adjusted his tie, the same deep gray as Equitas Air's planes, and stepped up to the podium. His presence commanded attention without demanding it, a skill he'd perfected over years of quiet observation. "Welcome," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Today isn't about speeches or ceremonies. It's about possibility." He gestured to the young people seated in the front rows. "Each of you represents what aviation should have been all along: diverse, dynamic, and determined." The scholarship recipients sat up straighter, their eyes fixed on Elijah. Among them was Amara Johnson, a 16-year-old black girl from the Bronx who'd dreamed of flying since she was 6. Next to her sat Fatima Hassan, wearing her hijab proudly, already certified in aerospace engineering at 19. Miguel Rodriguez, 18, had been rebuilding engines in his uncle's garage since he could walk. Elijah continued, his words measured and meaningful. "The name 17B might seem strange for a scholarship program. It's just a seat number after all. But sometimes the most powerful changes start in the most ordinary places." He paused, letting the words settle. That seat became an observation point, a witness stand, and finally, a catalyst for change. Now, it will become your launching pad. The ceremony transitioned into action. In the Academy's state-of-the-art simulation room, Amara Johnson sat in the pilot's seat of a Boeing 787 simulator. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the controls, but her face showed pure joy. The instructor, a woman who'd broken barriers herself as one of the first black female commercial pilots in the Northeast, guided her through the startup sequence. "Easy now," the instructor encouraged. "Feel the response of the controls." Amara's smile grew wider as the virtual aircraft responded to her touch. The simulator's screens showed a perfect day for flying, and as she eased back on the controls, the nose lifted smoothly off the virtual runway. Her laughter of pure delight echoed through the room. In another section of the academy, Fatima Hassan stood before a class of first-year aviation students. Though she was barely older than them, her knowledge of safety protocols was comprehensive and her delivery confident. She pointed to a diagram of aircraft emergency equipment, her voice clear and professional. "Safety isn't just about following rules," she explained, making eye contact with each student. "It's about understanding why those rules exist and how they protect everyone on board." The students, a diverse group themselves, took notes eagerly, several nodding in appreciation of her expertise. Down in the maintenance hangar, Miguel Rodriguez crouched over an open cockpit panel, his hands steady as he traced the intricate wiring. His mentor, a veteran mechanic with 30 years of experience, watched approvingly as Miguel identified and explained each component. "The auxiliary power unit connects here," Miguel said, pointing confidently. "It provides electricity when the main engines aren't running." His face broke into a proud grin as his mentor nodded in confirmation. Elijah moved quietly through these scenes, observing as he always did. But now his observations brought satisfaction instead of concern. He watched young people who had once been told they didn't belong in aviation take their first steps toward proving otherwise. Later that evening, Elijah returned to his apartment as the sun was setting over Manhattan. The space was minimal but comfortable, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city he'd helped reshape. His desk held stacks of applications for the next round of scholarships, each representing another dream waiting to take flight. As he sorted through his mail, a plain white envelope caught his attention. No return address, no identifying marks. Just his name and address in neat handwriting. He opened it carefully, sliding out a single sheet of paper. The note was brief, written in the same careful hand as the envelope. "I didn't understand what I was part of. I do now. KD double quote." Elijah held the paper for a long moment, recognizing the initials immediately. Karen Delaney, the flight attendant whose actions had been one of many catalysts for change. He didn't smile, but his expression softened slightly. Understanding was its own form of justice. He reached for his journal, the same one that had documented his undercover journey, and carefully placed the note between its back pages. Another piece of the story, preserved for whatever history might make of it. The next morning found Elijah in an empty Equitas air cabin before the day's first flight. The plane sat quietly at the gate, dawn light streaming through its windows. He moved down the aisle until he reached seat 17B. From his briefcase, he withdrew a small bronze plaque, about the size of a business card. Its surface gleamed in the early morning light, the engraved words simple but powerful. "From silence, justice." With careful movements, he secured the plaque to the back of the seat, visible but subtle, a quiet reminder of how change sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. He ran his fingers once over the engraved letters, then stepped back into the aisle. If you enjoyed the story of Elijah, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.